Dear Mrs. President, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, Excellencies, dear participants, speakers and moderators, I am really delighted to welcome you all here today. Bienvenue à tous.
Welcome to all of you.
Welcome. My name is Marilyn Neven. I'm Program Manager of International ID to the European Union, and I will be your Masters of Ceremonies during these 3 conference days. Allow me perhaps to start with mentioning the availability of simultaneous translation services. You will find the headphones in front of you, and this will be available during all plenary sessions. Si vous souhaitez écouter les interventions,
if you want to listen to French, opt for channel 1.
Canal.
We also have translation in Dutch on channel 2.
Switch to the 3rd channel. Live streaming is also available on International Ideas Facebook webpage. I may welcome you all today on behalf of the partners to this conference, the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, NIMD, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and the universities for Nottingham and Birmingham, who are co-directors of the Represent Research Center. And, of course, also hosting today International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Some of you have traveled far, even very far, to be with us today. Others have just taken the metro, but even that might be a challenge at times. But all of you are here today because you are determined to contribute to the formulation of responses to one widespread challenge to democracy, which is named populism. And you are here after your working hours, perhaps, and certainly during a very important World Cup football game. So, I thank you on behalf of the organizing partners for such an important commitment and for cooperating with us on shaping the global agenda for the renewal of representation. The opening plenary session that is about to start has the objective to set the stage for these 3 days of sessions, and we will do this together with outstanding speakers. The partners of the conference are grateful to the President of the Senate and staff for hosting this conference in this exceptional venue. And I hope that you all join me in feeling very privileged to be here today in the Palace of the Nation, which is the seat of the Belgian Federal Parliament. And the Senate is the one of 2 chambers where regions and linguistic communities meet. So it therefore marks the heart of democracy in the Belgian federal state. I will mention a couple of housekeeping rules and practicalities tomorrow morning, but may I already ask you kindly to turn off the sound of your mobiles, please? And for any comments and sharing on social media, please use the hashtag populism, which we are claiming for at least the next 3 days. So I wish you all a splendid conference and trust that it will inspire your actions, whether it be as politicians, authorities, or democracy support actors to counter populism. I now have the pleasure and the honor to introduce to you the host of this conference. Ms. Christine Defrane is the President of the Belgian Senate since 2014 and a leading politician for the Mouvement Réformateur in Belgium. President Defrane is a lawyer at the Bar of Liège. She's elected in the Council of the City of Liège. And she is also a member of the Parliament of Wallonia and the Parliament of the French Community, and delegated by the Parliament of the French Community to hold a seat in the Senate. Madame la Présidente, je vous remercie vivement.
I thank you very much for your hospitality, and it's an honor for me to invite you to take the floor. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, Messieurs les Premiers ministres, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers invités, c'est un immense plaisir de vous accueillir au Sénat belge dans cet hémicycle chargé d'histoire pour débattre d'un sujet partout au cœur des débats. L'avenir de la démocratie représentative en ces temps de populisme. En tant que chambre de réflexion, le Sénat a depuis toujours traité les questions fondamentales à l'essence même de la société. Il est aujourd'hui crucial de défendre nos valeurs démocratiques, de vivifier le système représentatif. Si la démocratie est le moins mauvais des systèmes, pour citer Sir Winston Churchill, il faut bien admettre que notre modèle est en crise. Le désenchantement face à ses limites se fait sentir au-delà de nos frontières. En fait, cette crise va au-delà de l'Europe, dépasse l'Europe. On a perdu confiance dans le système, on critique les institutions politiques et ceci mine le pouvoir des dirigeants de grands pays, comme nous avons pu le constater récemment aux États-Unis ou en Inde. Le citoyen se détourne du monde politique traditionnel. Il ne trouve plus dans le système représentatif les réponses à ses questions, à ses besoins. Ce désamour entraîne partout une recrudescence des courants extrêmes. Il favorise l'apparition de mouvements parfois très différents, mais tous populistes. Le populisme est un étendard de ralliement, de mouvements de rupture. Ces mouvements entendent incarner les revendications et les sentiments du peuple. Le populiste est généralement présenté comme celui qui va agiter certaines menaces et qui va présenter des solutions simples et compréhensibles par le plus grand nombre. Le populisme rassure le citoyen. La société évolue aujourd'hui très rapidement. Nous devons faire face à de nombreux défis. La crise économique, la mondialisation, le retour du religieux, la crise identitaire, le vivre ensemble, les évolutions technologiques et informatiques sont autant de facteurs qui ont radicalement changé notre modèle de fonctionnement. Cette évolution entraîne tout azimut des phénomènes de repli sur soi, reflet d'un sentiment d'incertitude, de peur, voire de perte de contrôle. Le populisme surfe sur ces peurs et vient flatter le citoyen, lui fait miroiter l'existence d'une solution miracle à tous ses problèmes. La logique interne des partis populistes repose sur une volonté de dépasser le clivage gauche-droite, sur l'affirmation d'un peuple unique et homogène dont le leader se veut le porte-voix direct et dont il estime recevoir un mandat impératif, ce qui a pour conséquence de réduire le rôle du Parlement. On peut également relever une critique des médias et des contre-pouvoirs. Toute critique émise à l'encontre du parti étant perçue comme un complot. Le populiste joue sur trois émotions: la peur, le ressentiment et l'intimité. Le populiste donc joue sur ces émotions et a besoin
of demographics, economics, losing their identity and feeling insecure. Since 2015,
je suis passée en fait sur le canal 1.
Boosted these movements, especially in Poland, Hungary, Austria, Germany and Italy. The fear of refugees, the fear of the very demographic and cultural fabric of our society has been turned upside down, and a feeling of insecurity, which is very easy to link to the first via Islam, are liable to generate the second emotion, that is resentment. And finally, the third factor we need to understand populist politics is the need for togetherness, being able to create a bond between a charismatic leader and a community and recreate the love of the group. Changes in how political institutions are organized and work are another reason why populism is rising at the expense of representative democracy. Political representation has become more complex and harder for people to understand. They feel that powers and responsibilities are becoming increasingly diluted as the number of institutions and offices grow. People do not always understand the guarantees and safeguards to the enlightened install. The fact that politicians so often plead there is little they can do as an excuse for being unable to change people's lives is liable to increase these feelings. The gulf between representatives and their constituents is growing, with specialists in one hand and laymen on the other. People are feeling increasingly removed from a political class which does not reflect them. They no longer see themselves in parties. Corruption, scandals, and a business climate have led people to become profoundly distrustful of politics. Today, traditional parties are asking themselves what questioning democracy by voting populists says about how representative democracy works. We need to take steps to improve democracy, particularly by involving people more in political decisions and giving them more control over those they elect. Electing people for shorter periods, installing recall procedures, enabling people to remove those elected while in office, providing better guarantees for certain supervisory bodies, encouraging diversity among those who represent us, and fighting partocracy are some of the steps which have been launched in this direction, which could help people trust their representatives more. People only feel they are represented if they understand how institutions work and what their representatives do. This means working to explain how institutions are organized. As you mentioned, Belgian Senate is the crossroad for the different segments of the country, always presented as the forum par excellence for thinking more deeply about complex social issues. I have any doubt that this prestigious international conference, with its outstanding work, will make a major contribution to the current debates. Thank you for your attention, and I know that it is particularly difficult because it's 5:15, and I don't know if Belgium has scored yet. And you, of course, are allowed to watch your smartphone, your table. You can browse, and I won't take it for an insult. So I hope you enjoyed your evening, and it's still, I recall, a great, great pleasure to host you here in our Senate and to welcome you. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, President of the Senate.
By introducing to you Mr. Yves Le Terme, who is Secretary General of International ID and former Prime Minister of Belgium. Mr. Le Terme, prior to International ID, was Deputy Secretary General of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. The building and the Senator's hemicycle, Mr. Secretary General, have no secrets for you, thanks to the parliamentary and ministerial mandates which you have held before. And finally, I also trust you will keep an eye on timing and proceedings, considering your background with numbers and with procedures as an administrator in the Belgian Court of Audit. So I'm very proud now to pass on the floor to you, Mr. Secretary General, and invite you to take over the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeline. It indeed gives a bit of special feeling to stand here and to use that rostrum that I used to use in other circumstances. But let me first of all, Madam President, thank you for your hospitality, for hosting this conference. It's an honor for us to be here. Let me also especially welcome President Correa and President Letta, the former president of the Italian government. We are very grateful for the fact that in your busy schedules, you both made time for us. It's a bit easy for you, Mr. Letta, because I recall that Italy is not really competing in Russia, but anyway, we appreciate very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also welcome you on behalf and on behalf of International ID, thank the co-organizing institutions with the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, the colleagues and friends from OSCE and ODIHR, the Represent organization, and last but not least, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. We at International IDEA feel really privileged to cooperate with such distinguished co-organizers. So this conference is titled Representation in the Age of Populism. But as a start, I think we should ask ourselves tomorrow and Wednesday during this conference, or at least start from the fact that populism as such, as a central concept for this conference, has not a real agreed upon definition until now. It has indeed, in the recent past, been widely used to refer to, in fact, very different movements, very different dynamics, very different things. It has been used in reference to nativism. Think about the example of Hungary, for instance. Reference to state brutality. Take the example of the Philippines, President Duterte, to majoritarianism, like in Poland with Lech Kaczynski. Anti-elitism, like Beppe Grillo in Italy, and of course also as a kind of synonym for good old demagoguery, like in the US currently. The excellent standard-setting scientist Cas Mudde has described populism, and I quote, "Populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism." An illiberal but democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. Populism, in that way, criticizes the exclusion of important issues, at least issues that the average citizen, the citizenry, find important, the exclusion of these important issues from the political agenda by the leading elites, and it calls, doing so, for the so-called repoliticization. However, this comes, of course, at a price. Indeed, populism's black and white views and uncompromising stand leads to a polarized society, for which, of course, both sides share a responsibility, but still it is there. Populism is always growing in a way that it polarizes society. And the majoritarian extremism denies legitimacy to opponents' views and weakens the rights of minorities. And while left-wing populism is often less exclusionary than right-wing populism, the main difference between them is not whether they exclude, but whom exactly they exclude, which is largely determined by their accompanying ideology, be it nationalism or extreme socialism. So, populism is really a concept that transcends classical left-right divisions. Leftist parties, rightist parties, and even central parties have all been accused by the others of the so-called populism. And yet, the tendency is that those that are accused of populism have become, anyway, increasingly popular, successful in elections. Indeed, today, as we speak in 2018, more than 25% of citizens in the European Union, every fourth European citizen, is in fact governed by a populist. We could ask ourselves then, whether populism is the real problem or whether it is just a reflection of lower trust of people in traditional politics and traditional mainstream politicians and mainstream political parties. Indeed, perhaps populism is just a symptom of a bigger, more fundamental and more dangerous problem, namely the lack of trust by average citizens, the lack of trust in the political system, or even worse, a political system that has failed the majority of the population. The question we can ask ourselves then is, if this is the case, and people feel, whether it is rightly or not, that the political system doesn't work for them, is it then a cultural issue, or is it an economic issue? Is it identity related, or is it an economic problem? Ladies and gentlemen, although of course it is clear that we should not all become populists, perhaps nevertheless there are a few things we can learn from populists and populist parties. For instance, the fact that they at least seek, at least as they say, seek to lend citizens who feel alienated by their government a sense of control. They speak about topics that are high on people's agenda, but are sometimes neglected on the political scene. And they also try to lower the threshold for internal participation. Populists want to reform the political system, and this will to reform is a key part of their agenda, and they want, at least they say, that they want to involve citizens to a much larger extent in decision-making. As an example, newcomers in Italy, in France, and in Spain, newcomers in the political scene, have all used a mix of consultative, explicitly consultative, grassroots consultative policy making, like open primaries, digital tools to facilitate citizen involvement. And speaking about technology, it is very relevant to also assess indeed the role technology has already played and is still playing in fueling populism. Remember, we thought that social media was just going to give to democratic societies new dimensions, giving voice to the voiceless. But it also seems to have now the massive use of technology seems to have been turning people against each other. Indeed, technology seems to fuel, to strengthen the tendency to populism, polarizing the political debate, manipulating public opinion. Ladies and gentlemen, I stop here. I used more than the 7 minutes I was entitled to. These are just some aspects of the themes we will discuss tonight, tomorrow, and Wednesday. I would like to conclude by thanking you for your presence, and you all look very fresh and willing to engage in conversations. I wish you very fruitful activities tonight, tomorrow, and Wednesday. And let's concentrate on, as people that are involved in debates about populism, let's concentrate on the answers we can give to the problems we are faced with and to the phenomenon of populism. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce the next speakers. And we are really very privileged that we have, besides the President of the Senate, tonight people that in their daily activities, but also based on their experience in the political scene and in their daily professional work, have a very precise, experienced view on the phenomenon of populism. The first guest I would like to invite to take the floor is Enrico Letta. Enrico Letta, it was already mentioned, a former president of the Italian government, a former prime minister of the Italian Republic. And what is also interesting is that in what I would call his reconversion, he is currently the dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po, where he also has an excellent view on the thinking, on the academic work, on issues like populism. Before serving as a prime minister 2013-14, Enrico Letta has been leading several government ministries. We know also that he's a true constructive European and democracy supporter, so I think he's very well placed to share with us his view based on his experience both in Italy, in academics, and on the European scene. his views on populism. We're very proud to have you amongst us tonight, Enrico, so please take the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Yves. Belgium didn't score until now, I'm sorry. I would like to thank you for this invitation, and I'm so happy to be here. It's a great opportunity for me. It is a great opportunity for me to be with el querido amigo Presidente Correa, la Présidente Madame Defraigne et vous tous. J'ai écrit mes drafts en français, donc vous m'excuserez si j'emploie la langue française pour mon exposé.
If you don't mind, I would like to speak French because I drafted my speech in French. And I would like to have an attitude which is not really conventional throughout my expose, because we're here to talk about populism, and we are not supposed to do it in a conventional way. That's why I would like to go against conventions, if you allow me. And first of all, I would like to tell you that I have been faced with a more conventional political history, a political history which was made by conventional political parties, not only in my own country but also at the European level. And if I'm to give you the names of two political leaders who were important for me, I would mention Jacques Delors and Helmut Kohl. So these are two key leaders for me, and what I'm going to tell you, by the way, is not contradictory with all the testimonies I've given up to now in my political career or my political life. And I would like to share with you a kind of experience I had the opportunity to develop in Paris, because we do have students from all over the world who came there with a view to have conversations and debates about the future of Europe. And I would like to raise three different bullet points, if you don't mind. First of all, I would like to share with you a different view over this topic, which has nothing to do with nostalgia. I think that we need to turn to the future being optimistic, and I also believe that the future of democracy and politics in our society is a future which is not attached to the past. You know, we don't need to refer to the past as being the only positive episode or the positive elements related to the history and the evolution of politics. And secondly, I would like to share with you my opinion about the concept of populism, because maybe we have different definitions enshrined within that particular term. And the third bullet point I would like to focus on is related indeed to the future. How can we deal with the new things, the new elements which led to some huge changes? And we need to turn these events into something positive. We need to use them in a positive way with a view to strengthen our society and with a view to strengthen our democracies and the democracies in place within our societies. As I told you, I have no nostalgia, you know, because the politics and the policies had to do with when I was young, belong to the past. And when I started, my political career before populism, I must say, policy making was made for men, for adults who were aged between 50 up to 80 years old. But if you look at the picture which was taken at the very beginning, because Yves Le Terme, was a very, very nice, because he referred to my European commitment. And you probably remember the picture which was taken in Rome at the level of the Campidoglio when we did manage to sign the treaty in 1957. If you look at that particular picture, and if you look at it on your tablets or on your smartphone, and if you go away from the football match between Belgium and Panama, you might feel something quite strange about that picture. That there is no lady on that particular picture. And we have at least 200 people in the room, and there is not a single woman on the picture. All are men. And it was the very beginning of the EU construction. I wanted to mention that because you can look at all the pictures of European Council meetings, for example, all those which took place during the last century. You will see most of the time men, and most of the time men aged between 55 up to 80 years old. So there was a lack of diversity at that particular time. And the picture is quite similar to the picture we had at the level of the meeting, which did elect the Pope, 30 or 40 years ago. So before populism, that's the kind of thing we had, because we had a meeting with the cardinals in the chapel. The Sixtine Chapel was supposed to elect the Pope. Well, I don't think that it is really better today, and I have some doubts about that. So, in our democracies, before populism, leadership was quite long, It was quite difficult, to avoid political leaders because they were there for their whole life, a bit like the Pope, by the way. But even today, the Pope could possibly decide to resign. But I met some politicians who have never resigned during their whole career. And now we can see that the situation has changed. But in the past it was quite slow. It was almost impossible for leaders to resign or to be changed. And in the past it was something which was quite impossible. I have some personal experience in the field, by the way, and I can share it with you. I spent many years of my life trying to get a recognition, or trying to be recognized as someone else than the youngest prime minister, because I became the prime minister when I was quite young. I was 32 years old, and in 1988 it was quite incredible, to see a young prime minister. And the only name I was given was the following one: the youngest prime minister ever appointed. And I decided to get more tangible results than that, although I had beaten Mr. Andreotti, which at the time was quite something. But maybe we could say that in the past we had a huge participation at the level of the people, and today we talk about disenchantment and things like that. But if we look at the level of participation of to the French and Italian elections over the last 12 months, for example, 75% of the people took part in the elections in Italy and in France, by the way, and Ronald Reagan was elected by 53% of American constituencies in 1980, which means that today we're not supposed to consider that our situation is worse than what it used to be, at least in terms of democracy. I told you a while ago that I wanted to be slightly provocative, and I'm trying, on purpose to be slightly provocative. And as I told you, my vision of the situation is the following. I do believe that all the obstacles, all the problems related to democracy are to be seen today. We have to be aware of them, but I'm not telling you that it was far better yesterday. There were a lot of problems yesterday, by the way, but I would like to insist upon the fact that being involved in policy making today is much more difficult today than it used to be before, because to be the President of the Republic, as it was the case of Mr. Correa, or to be a Prime Minister, as it was the case of Yves Le Terme, my dear friend, or to be the President of the Senate, to be a policy maker, either man or woman, who is fully involved in the political life, is something today much more complex and sophisticated than it used to be 30 years ago, because there is a lot of pressure on your shoulders, and the level of difficulty is to be compared to what it used to be before. And and is even greater. So we might wonder, what do we mean by populism? And what can we do with a view to get rid of all the negative elements attached to populism? Because of that, we know how difficult it is to manage this situation. And I would say that first and foremost, populism is a very sophisticated idea, which does enshrine a series of different things. Mrs. Defresne and Mr. Le Terme pinpointed it a while ago. We need to make some nuances regarding that particular concept. And indeed, when we do talk about populism today, we do talk about unconventional or non-traditional political groups or parties. And most of the time we deal indeed with political parties which are outside of traditional political families, those families which built the democracies in Western Europe. So by populist parties, we mean all those who are not part of this big families, or those families which built the democracy in the western part of Europe. But indeed, we also need to insist upon the fact that populist is also the term used today with a view to hide something which is even worse than populism, i.e. xenophobia and nationalism. Because 20 years ago, we would have called it xenophobia and nationalism. But today, we put this into one single box, i.e. populism. And the very success of those political parties is a success which is not only due to the leaders or the fact that the leaders are well known, but most of the time it is the outcome of the mistakes made by the establishment of our different countries, or the countries which are now in the hands of those political parties. And once again, I'd like to be a bit provocative, but I don't believe that the Brexit is a huge success for Mr. Farage. I do believe that the Brexit is also the outcome of the mistakes made by the establishment, because they wanted to organise a referendum which was organised in the UK. And maybe we can consider that Mr. Trump is there because he did win the elections, or maybe he did win because the two traditional political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, made both of them choices which did serve Mr. Trump to a certain extent. And I could possibly mention my own country, and I could give you examples about other countries as well. But I do believe it would be a good idea to stop here. I simply want to insist upon the fact that citizens do very quickly get tired, about that, and have some reactions when I see those people from the establishment pretending it's either me or a disaster. And this could possibly be the beginning of the successful tide or the successful rise of populism. Because if you have the choice between the continuity to a certain extent and a disaster or chaos, it is quite easy, of course, after one try or two attempts, to lead people to believe that the disaster we have in mind is not the disaster mentioned by people. And it is something indeed which played a role in a very recent past, because the word populism, and I would like to come back on what Mrs. the President of the Senate mentioned, and I would like to come back and quote Mr. Yves Le Terme, because it is indeed related to the people, to the citizens. Because what is the main feature, the leading feature of those political parties? Well, it is indeed the direct relationship between the leader and the citizens. And there is a lack of interface, there is no interface in between the two. And I would like to share with you the third element and share with you my conclusions. Because indeed, when we talk about this lack of interface between the leaders and the citizens, it is maybe related to what the internet is changing in our lives and in the service economy.
but also in universities. When I look at the changes brought by internet in universities, when you have the possibility to check online what the teacher, the professor says, is it correct or not? The student is not only a pilgrim listening to a priester and having to shut up. The student today has a tablet in front of him, and if a teacher is not accurate in what he says, if he doesn't code the right figure, the student can immediately check it, and immediately the teacher is going to lose its authority, because he is in a difficulty. So this lack of interface, it means that people, citizens, voters, consumers, the audience, they get the power and not the ones who have a microphone in their hand. And this is the big element in this change. And these are my conclusions. How can you be positive? And what can you do? Because we have internet, and this is a challenge indeed to representative democracy. What can we do for the internet to become something positive for our democracies? Because I'm deeply convinced that representation cannot be substituted or deleted by any other governance methods. This is a representation which remains necessary. What can we do for internet to support this representation? Well, the first item in my conclusions are the supranational character or feature, European or even above Europe. We were talking about migration, Mrs. President, and they are a subject where there is no possibility anymore to have national solutions. We cannot have national solutions. We need to take supranational solutions. But if the supranational solutions are only based on intergovernmental proceedings, so only the representative of the government of the country will meet with the representatives of other governments, then all decisions taken are less legitimate, less strong, and the relationships with people, with citizens. We see it with the experience of the European Parliament. It's a positive experience, but it's still not enough. It's still insufficient. The places, the locations where decisions are being taken must, and it's often the case, must be locations, areas where myself as a citizen, I have a voice. And it's not only the leader of my government who is going to decide on my behalf, because I need to be represented in a broader way. And this has an impact on the role of international organizations, the United Nations, the role of Europe, and also the migrations and the problems. There is also a major issue related to political movements. How can we have, between brackets, lighter political movements being able to renew themselves regularly, not being blocked in a situation where they are basically blocked by the cumbersome machine, the apparatchik, the nomenclatura, which basically create other expectations, and citizens will ask for other solutions, other alternatives, other options. So we need a representative democracy where new movements can pop up and express themselves. Of course, we have to know that we are here in an assembly, here at the Senate, and I think it's essential to have laws in each country, also voting rights, and of course the right to take the floor and the right to speak speak up, but they must be able to get represented on the one hand side, but on the other hand side, governability is also requested. So both things together is important, not the one or the other. Today, we see it. We have many crises. For instance, I'm going to take an example. Italy and France. I live in Paris. I have always, of course, followed Italian politics, and I'm going maybe to, express my point of view, but just have a look at the last two elections in France and in Italy. You have, at the end of the day, the same result during the first round of the French elections. 49% of the votes were indeed, the votes went to the so-called populist parties. But France, even if 49% of the citizens had voted for these people, they have now a president in France, a single president, and a parliamentary majority, which is absolutely not populist. And in Italy, you've got the same figure, 49% of citizens. But because the electoral regulations or bills are totally different, it means at the end of the day that out of these 49%, we have now a new political framework, and we have a so-called populist government now. Have a look at the difference between both countries, because they have different electoral systems. Two countries, they are quite comparable, quite close to each other, but the results which were at the basis the same now are different. So the question of electoral bills, pieces of legislation, this is also very important. And then I've still two items I would like to tackle very, very briefly and very, very quickly before concluding. It's the positive issue of Internet. Internet and this time linked to the cost of politics. Using Internet rightly will enable basically a cost-cutting exercise in politics and also electoral campaigns. And I think that curbing costs, political cost, is essential for political democratization. We are talking about a market economy, of course, but therefore you need, of course, a control on the access possibility. Everyone must be able to get access to these new techniques or technologies, and it means that independent authorities should be able to intervene in order basically to guarantee or to avoid fake news, to be sure that what is said, what is published is real. And we cannot have fake news. This is very important. Truth is essential and cannot be replaced by lies. And I think, and this is my last item, the democracy of today. Today's democracy means that there is more turnover. So there is no career of a political man or a political woman during a lifetime. There is a turnover, you change. So sometimes it means you leave the political world and then you can be trained. You cannot be, for instance, in an assembly, or you cannot be in a town office before, for instance, knowing what is a budget, how to operate a budget, what does that mean, the constitution of one's own country. And we see that this turnover today weakens basically the know-how of people. I think there might be a solution. We have to be creative, and I think that all the organizers of this important and interesting event, all the organizers can work on it, definitely, and can find with universities, because we are trying to work already with universities. We can try to produce new ideas. That was my conclusion. I wanted to be, of course, a bit provocative, but I wanted basically to share with you the spirit of this event. I wanted to be very honest, what was my point of view, basically, and I wanted also to add that the future might be brighter than the past. It's our role, but also your role, to improve the future. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you. Roberta, you delivered an excellent introductory speech to this conference, touching upon lots of aspects of populism. I would like at least to point out some of them as a kind of appetizer for our discussions tomorrow and Wednesday. I found it very important that tonight we can start with a kind of positive approach also, that, and I cite you literally, that future can be better than past, and that the discussion about populism also can be used to improve the functioning of our democracy. You put forward some ideas about the disintermediation that is a fact, and the role of transnational institutions like the European Parliament that are still a bit seeking their exact role. The proposal to have an independent authority to do some fact-checking in order to, let's say, bring back the populist statements, to check them with reality and to be sure that arguments are based on objective facts. And last but not least, I found very interesting your proposals or the remarks you made concerning the need for people, when given a certain turnover, certainly they are confronted with the responsibility to rule, let's say, a local authority, or to rule the country, to have at least training, to be trained, and to have the competences needed to exert these very important responsibilities. It's only a snapshot of your important statements that enrich our debates, but I'm sure that colleagues will have taken note carefully, and that we will continue on some of these very interesting thoughts. May I now ask President Rafael Correa to join the rostrum. Rafael Correa, that, ladies and gentlemen, served as the President of Ecuador during 2 consecutive terms, during the period 2007 till 2017, until very recently. During his tenure as President, Mr. Correa served as President pro tempore of the Union of South American Nations, and also of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Mr. President, you were in fact elected on a very substantive platform project of democratization in your country, but of course had also to face lots of challenges on that road. Recently you almost became a Belgian, but anyway you continue to advocate for democracy. We will listen very carefully to your thoughts as a experienced leader that has been facing the challenges of populism, but that also has been trying to propose a change in democracy, a change in the functioning of democracy in your own country, and has been confronted with challenges on that road. Thank you very much, and please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yves. Enrico a dit qu'il était très provocatif.
Well, my colleague said it was very provocative, so I'm going to be very provocative as well, but I'm going to speak English because my intervention is in English.
Me, Christine, thank you very much for hosting this event, Yves for the invitation, and Enrico for sharing this floor with me, and all of you guys for coming, especially when the Diable Rouge are playing the first match against Panama, a little 0-0, match null. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his book, Democracy in America, written in 1835, describes the United States as a true democracy. He was surprised by the quality of conditions he observed in that country. But that true democracy was reserved only for white people. The Native Americans were exterminated, and African descendants were enslaved until a century after the inauguration of the so-called democracy. It took another century for people of color to have, at least formally, equal rights. Despite being known as the oldest democracy in the world, it took the United States centuries to fulfill the principles of equality and freedom enshrined in its founding documents. We usually consider democratization as a monolithic, linear, and teleological process, assuming that European states were born as democracies. Does it mine? This is my water? Yes. This assumption is wrong. The construction of democracy has to be contextualized. It is important to understand the political place and the historical moment before we can assess whether a process of democratization is underway or has been achieved. Virtually all of us, apart from certain theocratic or absolutist regimes, believe in democracy. Yet, this one-size-fits-all idea of democratic and non-democratic governance preached by the Western liberal democracies, when it is convenient, fails to identify that democratic challenges may be very different, depending on the context at hand. Yet, this approach has meant that developing countries have often conformed, without too much reflection on their own democratic shortcomings, to the preferences of Western democracies. This diktat is expressed through such things as the indices of the quality of democracy, like those of Freedom House and The Economist. These often resort to simplistic categories to qualify democracies in the developing countries, using epithets such as hybrid, authoritarian, imperfect, etc. It is easy to manipulate the criteria in order to disqualify certain types of democracies. But, for instance, if we choose the government's popular support as a necessary criterion for a democratic regime, then Bolivia is far more democratic than any European country. If we choose the prohibition of the inheritance of social positions through the bloodline, then European monarchies are less democratic than Latin American republics. If we choose the identification of people with their governments, Latin American populism are far more democratic than the European elites and technocratic regimes. If we choose the level of citizen participation in elections, again, Latin America performs better than European countries and the US. Apart from some necessary but not sufficient conditions, such as the existence of periodic, general, and transparent elections, there are no universal criteria for measuring the quality of democracies. Unfortunately, the criteria used to assess democratic vibrance are all too frequently ideological and often Eurocentric. The Inter-American Declaration on Democracy imposes two more requirements for a regime to be deemed democratic: the rule of law and the separation of powers. The first
Alors, le tout premier implique l'égalité devant la loi, ainsi qu'un cadre normatif sur base duquel on va pouvoir jouer ce jeu de la démocratie. En d'autres termes, la volonté d'une majorité peut s'exprimer, mais ne suffit pas, malheureusement, à garantir une légitimité démocratique. Alors, ceci a pu bénéficier de l'apport de la législation. Et un exemple du contraire est en fait le récent référendum de l'indépendance qui a été mené à bien en Catalogne. La deuxième condition, c'est la séparation des pouvoirs, je vous l'ai dit il y a quelques instants, et celle-ci repose sur une série d'équilibres, de pondérages, de pondérations et de contre-pondérations où on parvient à rééquilibrer les pouvoirs. Et c'est un modèle qui est proposé par le baron de Montesquieu dans un de ses ouvrages qui a été publié à Genève en 1748. Donc, il y a plus de 270 ans. Donc Montesquieu était inspiré par toute une série de lois et de doctrines en réaction à l'absolutisme. Alors il est assez surprenant de constater que, en dépit de l'apport culturel, technologique et social et des changements qui se sont opérés au niveau de la société, que le modèle de Montesquieu et les tentatives d'amélioration que nous y avons apportées ont fait en sorte que la démocratie libérale scelle en quelque sorte la fin de l'histoire. Alors ceci nous amène bien entendu à nous retrouver ici aujourd'hui pour débattre d'une question de la plus haute importance. Nous devons sortir des sentiers battus en termes de réflexion et dès lors questionner certains éléments et remettre en balance certains de nos événements historiques pour les pondérer et essayer d'améliorer la situation. Alors ces équilibrages s'appliquent également aux interactions dialectiques entre les gouvernements d'une part et l'opposition d'autre part. Quoi qu'il en soit, on s'inspire ici de l'idée selon laquelle l'opposition entre la thèse et l'antithèse débouche systématiquement sur une meilleure synthèse que les précédentes. Et c'est une hypothèse qui est bien entendu basée sur une certaine forme d'optimisme plutôt que sur un raisonnement digne de ce nom. Dès lors, nous pouvons considérer que les démocraties peuvent être améliorées grâce à une démocratie beaucoup plus participative. Et ceci requiert des mécanismes spécifiques pour contrôler, bien entendu, les représentants, suggérer des règles et des politiques à appliquer. La démocratie, ainsi que la démocratie au niveau des municipalités, doit permettre aux citoyens de se rassembler et de résoudre ensemble les problèmes de la collectivité. Alors, même si nous avons une démocratie directe et participative, celle-ci a bien entendu ses limites. Alors, il est assez courant de suggérer que les gens savent toujours mieux ce qui est mieux pour eux. Les citoyens savent généralement ce qui est mieux pour eux. Alors, ça semble joli et ça semble rassurant également, mais ce n'est pas toujours la vérité. Et ceci est bien entendu...
Democracy to work, and I should say, for our life in society to work, we require principles, values and common objectives, equity and social cohesion, empowered, educated and informed citizens, and responsible politicians acting within an institutional system legitimized by the society. This set of conditions is called social capital. Without social capital, democracy cannot operate. Unfortunately, in Latin America, because of the extreme inequality and excessive power of the elite, that social capital has always been incipient. And in today's world, because of rising inequality, the supremacy of markets over societies, and the supremacy of capital over human beings, this social capital is disappearing. Income inequality has increased in nearly all world regions in recent decades. But in Europe, it remains at an all-time high. In the 1980s, the average income of the richest 10% was 7 times higher than that of the poorest 10%. Today, it is around 9.5 times higher. The economic recovery has not reversed the long-term trend towards increasing income inequality. If we are to use epithets to define democracies, then Western democracies can also be called mercantile democracies, because the dominance of the market entelechy is such that even the quality of democracy is sometimes measured according to the size of its market. Everything that benefits profit maximization is deemed technical, whereas everything that seeks the well-being of human beings is considered populist. In this format, political power does not act on behalf of the populace, but in defense of capital. Western democracies might also be called mass media democracies, because the media has become more important in the political process than the political parties and electoral systems. In many regards, the media has supplanted the rule of law by the rule of opinion. If we agree that democracy requires balance of powers, we should ask ourselves what is the counterpower of the press? The greatest de facto power in Latin America. What is the democratic legitimacy of a political actor whose only merit was to have enough money to buy a printing press? I am convinced that good mass media are vital for democracy. But I am also convinced that bad mass media are lethal for democracy. And the Latin American mass media are extremely bad. Today, populism is portrayed as one of the greatest threats to democracy. Populism has become one of the most fashionable terms of our times. Yet, no one knows for sure what it means. It is often used in a pejorative way, but to denote very different things. I remember Republicans branding Obama as a populist. Today, it is the Democrats who brand Trump as just that. Using a more rigorous analysis, populism can be defined as the relationship between the leader and the masses, without any mediation. If we change the word leader with representative and masses with citizens, this definition sounds much better. According to Ernesto Laclau, from Argentina, we can also define populism as a sort of hyperpolitics in a moment of great polarization between the people and its nemesis. This implies a level of conflict and change, and a broad popular platform that articulates concepts to which different groups provide different content, the so-called anti-signifiers. This generates popular will, people united behind a common project. Churchill and de Gaulle will be good examples of this approach to populism against, in their case, a foreign enemy and an ideological threat, and a very real threat indeed. But under this logic, liberals also resort to populist empty signifiers that generate broad civilizational consensus and allow them to legitimize themselves. For example, the concept of freedom. For them, freedom is non-intervention. For the left, freedom is non-domination. Why are liberals not seen as populists? Because populism is characterized by challenging the political norms, the usual order of things. In order to be populist, you must be an anti-status quo maverick. It can be argued that populism is a sort of anti-institutionalism. The problem is that some of the people who were branded as populists, I include myself, were highly institutionalist. We created institutions, a modern state almost out of nowhere. And we were perhaps the most technical government in Ecuadorian history. So even an Ecuadorian scholar, a political opponent, called us techno-populist, which is apparently a contradiction. So another way of defining populism is a sort of anti-current institutionalism. If that is what it is, then it should be a welcome political language when institutions are insufficient to solve problems, when there is a loss of faith in representative, in politics, in democracy itself. Certainly, Laclau's more linguistic and symbolic definition of populism can help us understand the reason why we can have right-wing and left-wing populism, and the impossibility of a priori judgments. In Europe, right-wing populism are back, usually proposing an extreme form of nationalism. They are based on fear and uncertainty. Fear of migration, fear of terrorism, fear of foreigners, uncertainty about maintaining your lifestyle, your culture, uncertainty about the sustainability of your pensions, uncertainty about consequences of high indebtedness. The right-wing populism, if not for its participation in elections, will have many traits in common with fascism, which emerged precisely because of the failure of democracies after the First World War. Fascism gave certainty, while the still flimsy European democracies generated uncertainty. And of course, there is also left-wing populism in its worst form, that of the charismatic leader offering miraculous solutions to the problems of the people with irresponsibility, demagoguery, and patronage. But too many times, the ones that the media single out as populists are simply popular. It seems to have become truly unthinkable to imagine popular politicians in certain societies. So, charismatic leadership is now demonized per se. Yet, leadership is nothing more than the ability to influence others. Leadership can therefore be good or bad, depending on whether it is employed to serve the people or whether it uses the people to serve the leader. As has happened all over the world, good leadership is highly desirable for development, even more so when institutions are still weak. From the beginning of the century, many leftist governments came to power democratically in Latin America. We were called populists because we tried to do politics differently to obtain different results. In Latin America, anything challenging the status quo is referred to as populism by the elites and their mass media. To divide us, we were called the vegetarian left and the carnivorous left. The first, represented by Lula, Pepe Mujica, Michelle Bachelet. The second, the bad guys in the movie, were Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, and myself. They were the vegetarian left, supposedly, because they were not populist, but institutionalist, and did not confront as much as we did. Using the judicialization of politics, the so-called lawfare, today, Lula is unjustly imprisoned, which is the only way that the right and its press have found to defeat progressive leaders. Pepe Mujica, example of statesman for many, is free. But when he was my age, he was incarcerated and tortured in a dirty prison by the Uruguayan dictatorship. Something similar happened to Mandela. It seemed that populist leaders can over time be regarded as statesmen when we are no longer a threat to particular interests. The Latin American bourgeoisie is not worried about whether the left is vegetarian or carnivorous. Those are formal things. The Latin American bourgeoisie fears social justice and equal opportunities for all. Democracy is accepted until it threatens to change the status quo. This is what explains the military interventions of the 1970s or today's new strategy of soft coup d'etat, as in Brazil and Ecuador, and the blatant electoral frauds, as in Honduras. We were also called populists because these political processes were led by charismatic leaders with great popular support. But in the developing world, as we have seen, leadership has become a vice, not a virtue. In fact, we can find incredible double standards. If Evo Morales wants to present himself for his fourth election, which he will surely win, he's little less than a mafia boss, and the Bolivian system is a dictatorship. If Angela Merkel wins her fourth election, she's a leader, and Germany is a mature democracy. Our discourse was also said to be populist because it was polarizing the country. We were accused of creating fictitious enemies of the people, the economic elite and the mass media. For some Western intellectuals, our discourse was far too simplistic and caricatural, and sought to manipulate the masses against our political opponents. But this analysis is also wrong. Some of these intellectuals have made biased interpretations, projecting their own reality on ours. Our discourse was not based on fiction. It reflected reality. How can the most unequal continent in the world not be polarized? I would have liked to see Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves with applause of the slavers. Our discourse shed light on, but was also the mirror of, the grave social injustices of our continent, and bravely denounced it. Moreover, following Chantal Mouffe's argument, conflict in a democracy is healthy. It allows demands to be heard and debated. Peaceful conflict is the driver of change. Thomas Jefferson is the principal author of one of the most beautiful documents of the history of humanity, the Declaration of Independence of the United States of 1776, a document whose second paragraph says, "We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." What a beautiful words. But it turns out that Jefferson owned about 600 slaves. I have no doubt Jefferson believed what he said. What he did not believe was that his slaves were also human beings. This still happens with Latin American elite 240 years later. When they talk about democracy, justice, freedom, happiness, they speak only of themselves, since they are incapable of understanding that fundamental rights must be applied to all. Because of our elite's exclusive control over political power, Latin America has become the most unequal region in the world. In Latin America, the use of the pejorative populist label can cause political inertia and prevent people from becoming active actors of their own development and the authors of their own democracy. Democracy, more than a mean, is an achievement, a kind of superior good, and every country must find its own way for democratization and its own democratic model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for this very rich and enriching intervention. I propose that your text would be circulated amongst the participants. I won't repeat, even in summary, what you have given as food for thought for the coming couple of days here at our meeting. I would just like to friendly mention that one of the institutionalists of Latin America, President Michelle Bachelet, will come to conclude the seminar, and so we will give her the right of defense from her side Wednesday. Ladies and gentlemen, we heard two voices from the political scene, but of course in addressing issues of populism, the civil society and political movements play an essential role. And so that's the reason why we have asked, or the organizers have invited, two voices from civil society and from the citizens' movements to address also the audience. And so first I would like to introduce to you Mrs. Delia Ferreira, that serves as the global chair of Transparency International. Prior to assuming her duties as Transparency International, Madame Ferreira served in various public sector and academic positions, after which Madame Ferreira moved the focus to anti-corruption work as the director of the Argentinian affiliate of Transparency International called Poder Ciudadano locally, and now she serves as the global chair of Transparency International. Given the fact that corruption, at least the feeling that democracy is biased, the feeling citizens, the perception citizens seem to have, a very important part of the citizens seems to have, I think that your assessment of the situation of our democratic societies and how we struggle with the issues of populism, fueled sometimes by the feelings of not being understood by political leaders and the role of corruption, I think that all participants in this meeting are very keen to hear you on this subject, and so I would like to ask you, from your point of view, how can politicians kind of bridge this gap between citizens and leadership? How can they restore the trust between citizens and political leadership? Before giving you the floor, just mention that Belgium leads 1-0 against Panama. Please, Madame Ferreira, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Leutern. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the results. How to restore trust? One thing that we have to take into account is that trust is like energy. It doesn't disappear. It reoriented itself. It transforms itself, and that's what we have been seeing in many countries. The lack of trust in traditional institutions or liberal institutions or democratic institutions, as you want to call them, is the result of this necessity of the people to trust, to believe, to have hope, and to have the responses to their necessities truly fulfilled. And this trust has shifted to populism in many countries. And that has been so, particularly, we have heard very interesting speeches. This has been the result, in part, of the impossibility of democracies nowadays to respond efficiently to the needs of people. The unfulfilled promises of democracies may be at the cause of this lack of trust in traditional democratic institutions. So in order to restore this trust, I would say that politicians should try to restore credibility in the first step. And credibility means the connection to people in two ways: the language they use and the content they express. And particularly, one thing is very important: the coherence between commitments and speeches and discourses and filling the gap with reality. We are really, from civil society, fed up of hearing new presidents or the new CEOs of business after scandals saying we are committed to fight against corruption. My impression is that many of our leaders know quite well what corruption is and have no idea of what commitment means in terms of enforcement, implementation, and action. Second thing, I would say that politicians should talk about not only what, but how, and with which results, in what term, and with what impact in people's life. On the same side, or parallel to this, they have to work on restoring tolerance and forbearance in the use of power. What we have seen in many populist regimes is concentration of power, abuse of state resources, use of the gatekeepers and the referees in society as not watchdogs, but lapdogs in order to protect themselves and consecrate immunity and impunity, and as attack dogs against the opposition. That has been what we have been seeing in many populist regimes in Latin America, and I come from Argentina, where we have, you haven't mentioned Cristina Kirchner, President Correa, who was one of the leaders that was really noticeable in this time in Latin America. And that's what we have been seeing, using referees in terms of the judiciary, with capture of the judiciary, public prosecutors, tax agencies, intelligence agencies, and regulatory agencies, not as neutral, impartial, independent, competent, and with resourceful organizations for the well-being, but as ways and means to restrain the space of civil society and to fight against those who were considered enemies. One of the great challenges of politicians in the post-populist regimes is to rebuild or build the bridges of the gap of polarization, of partisanship, of creating anyone who is not with them as an enemy. We cannot create real democracies for the sake of and well-being of all, with equality of all and for all, without tolerance and without accepting that power is not absolute. Power should be restricted. And in order to end my comments here, political parties were mentioned. Political parties are not the same political parties we had 12 or 2 centuries ago. They have to change, they have to adapt to the context and to circumstances. But political parties have to play a role as gatekeepers for democracy against populist authoritarian regimes. They had to fulfill a very important role, together with electoral management bodies, which are also referees in these societies, avoiding manipulation of electoral rules or electoral procedures as a way to control opposition or even to eliminate opposition. I would leave it here for the rest of the comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I have taken note of the need to restore credibility in terms of the language and the content of the proposals, to go beyond promises towards real commitment by politicians, having clarity, number 2, on the what and the how in terms of results. Also the need to use more tolerance and forbearance in the use of power, with specifically the treatment of opposition by populist leaders, the need to have real independent powers, and last but not least, the political parties as gatekeepers and the role of electoral management bodies. Thank you very much for these statements. It is 2-0 for Belgium. Last but not least, also a voice from a citizens' movement, a movement momentum in Hungary, by Katalin C. I hope I pronounce it. No? Yeah, well, anyway. Welcome to Katalin C. Madame C. is the vice president of the Momentum movement in Hungary and is one of the party's founding members. And in the past few years, Madame C. has worked on a number of projects focusing on international regional cooperation, youth involvement, and gender equality. I give you the floor for your statements as a reaction to what was said already, and maybe ask you also to focus a little bit on the role of young people and specifically how young people can, through their actions, protect democratic freedoms while representing very diverse values in the democratic processes. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, Mr. Prime Ministers, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, I am very honored to be here and be able to speak at this beautiful location. And I'm quite sure that I won't be able to compete with how exciting the game is, but I would just like to grab this opportunity to talk a bit more about how young people can take part and why they are not taking part so far. Well, I'm coming from a movement that was founded by 8 fellow friends of mine 2 years ago in a basement. So that's maybe not a big surprise if I would say that the first and foremost thing that anybody, not only young people, but like anybody could do is to come forward and be active and let our voices to be heard. Obviously, we all know and we've all heard like very, very much about disillusion in the entire society. And I would say that it's particularly true for young people. There is this phenomenon that could even end in a vicious spiral, that young people are not active. So therefore, politicians are not paying attention to young people enough. So therefore, young people do not feel represented. They do not feel that anybody is talking to them. Just to give an example, we had elections in Hungary a couple of months ago, and the 2 big topics of the campaign was from the government side is how to build a fence to keep the migrants out, and from the opposition side is how to raise the pensions higher. This mic works better. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. I hope it's better now. So, do I turn it off? So I just wanted to cite some personal examples that very, very frequently in the daily political narrative, there is not enough topics that young people could feel connected to, and also age-wise. Of course, we've heard very important remarks about the need of experience, but also we have to note that in some countries there are restrictions of the minimum age of somebody to be able to hold a position, and this minimum age is sometimes even 35 or even older. So that can very easily lead to a very serious disillusionment and lose of trust from young people to our society. And it's very, very visible that young people are moving out from this discourse. Young people either just say that I don't even need this. I just do my life, raise my family, do good in my job, and I don't really care about the news anymore. Or the other is that they try to fuel their energy, their creativity, their opinions through different ways, through music, through art, and not even considering representation as a tool for channeling in new ideas. But we all know that citizen mobilization and active citizenship is one of the best ways to counter populism, to counter ideas that have been discussed to very much detail today. And this is particularly true for anybody who just being felt left out of this entire dialogue. And obviously it's true for everybody, or like so many people in society. But there is this big generational divide between how the people who are considered to be young nowadays in their upbringing compared to the upbringing of the societies of a couple of decades older. And that is particularly true in my region in Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe, where many of the young people, most of the young people, they were born in a free democracy, or they were at least raised in a free democracy. However, the political establishment, their core representatives, they belong to another system, an older system, and the state itself and the institutions itself, they are still the old-style paternalistic, not empowering institutions where young people just don't feel that they have a place at. The healthcare system is just the same that it used to look when my mother was born, the same when I was born, and the same now. And also education system, we use the same textbooks, for instance, in my country. The change is not happening in society, and young people are just like growing tired of fighting with something or trying to understand something that is not speaking their language. And however, it is of like very, very important for everybody in civil society or in politics or every segment of those people who want to do something for society to try to engage young people, try to channel in new ideas, try to choose platforms, for instance, that are not being used by politicians at all. Digital media, for instance, is a tool where politics are still very much underrepresented compared to what activity goes on in YouTube for general or in Twitter for general. There are like alternative realities where young people are taking more interest in compared to politics. However, politics is so much more important regarding their daily lives, and we need to raise awareness, and we need to try to include as many new people in the discourse as possible. Otherwise, those ideas are lost, or those ideas are lost for legislation. Those ideas are lost for the public good, and they are channeled into a very, very good band or a very creative art piece, which are like very important also. But we just couldn't let an entire generation to leave the political discourse, the political spectrum. And I'm very positive, coming from my own experience, that if the system, if the society doesn't change to make space for new people, then the new people will try to make space for themselves. But I would be very much happier if maybe not too much young 20-something-year-old people would feel the need to find a party for themselves because they didn't feel represented by any others. I believe that there should be a synergy between the different generations and age groups to create a society that is good and welcoming for everybody. And this society has to be more innovative. It has to empower people to take part. It has to build on stakeholder participation and not on paternalism. It has to give space for creativity, for action. And we have to show initiative, also from youth, also from those who are outside so far, but also of those actors who are in the system, that young people are indeed welcome. If we don't open space, there is a very, very big challenge in case of these energies are being lost or being channeled into something else. So I'm very hopeful that such a change will take place soon, and the youth will find its way forward, and there will be indeed a big transformation in the ways of how young people perceive politics, because passivity is not a way forward. It's not a way forward to compete for our democratic freedoms.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you for putting the representation of the younger generations more specifically on the map for these 2 days of seminar on our agenda, starting from indifference, the lack of representation, the issue of the generational divide, but concluding with quite a hopeful statement that you think that the younger generations at the end will find their way to take their position, to take their stake in the political debate. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't see the clock, but yeah, I see the clock. It's a little bit, we are running out of time, but I think that there is a drink now here offered by the Senate of Belgium, so thank you very much for that. I would like to thank the speakers for this opening session of our 3 days seminar, and I think the activities start tomorrow at 9:15 here in this plenary room on the issue of the introduction and the objectives of the meeting, and we will then have the speakers on behalf of the co-organizing organizations. Thank you for the time being for your attention, for your attendance and attention to this introductory session, and I invite you to the drink, and I see you back tomorrow morning here in this room for the first session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these very warm applauses for our very distinguished speakers of today. They have all illustrated the theme of the conference by sharing their views based on a very long-standing political or practitioner experience on the modalities of populism, but also by expressing some very fresh views on how to move forward. And we will certainly build on that tomorrow and on Wednesday. So I hope that you are as eager as I am to come back tomorrow morning at 9:30, as Mr. Secretary General already mentioned. And I was asked to pass on a couple of practical announcements to you also. Please come well in advance, because there might be long queues to pass the security check in time, because we will try to start sharp at 9:15. And please also do not forget the badges you have received for today. So I invite you now also to follow the ushers of the Senate. It is the same ones who will also help you to leave the building after the reception. Please come with us, have a great evening, and we see each other back tomorrow morning in this hemicycle. Thank you very much.